if you have to articulate your beliefs to someone else, then you're forced to think, do I really believe them, and do these make sense? And when it creates such a taboo around religion and dialogue, especially between religions, we create prejudice. So, part of my aim with this video is to let you into my thought process and my experiences to hopefully help create a little bit of empathy between faith lines, and also if you maybe yourself are questioning your own faith, create a sense of understanding and knowing that there are other people out there who maybe don't think so differently from you. Welcome to story time. So, I want to start out here with a little bit of personal experience so you guys have some idea of where I'm coming from. So, I'm a big fan of night walks. I can't really explain why, but something about the suburban houses at night and the trees against the night sky is just so relaxing to me and has always helped me clear my head and have my best thoughts. So, on a particular walk, on a cold January evening, I came to a little bit of a realization. This is something of a personal epiphany. So, I should give you a little bit of background. I was raised Roman Catholic and was very invested in my faith growing up. I was sent to a Catholic school for elementary, middle, and high school. I attended church every week. At first, when I was younger, by my parents' choice, but then once I became old enough to drive, by my own choice. I would attend extracurricular religious events, club meetings and such, multiple times a week. And I even attended multiple Catholic youth conferences, so I took this stuff seriously. So, to all my friends and family, I was as happy and dedicated to their faith as a kid could be, and that made them very proud of me, which in turn made me proud of myself. But what I didn't talk about at the time was internally I was not well. I had these obsessive thoughts and really unhealthy feelings. I would constantly ask myself if I was willing to die for God, which to me now sounds absurd, but at the time it felt like such an important question that I had to be able to answer in a certain way. I would fear that I had just sinned and would go to hell for it after I did anything that could have been considered wrong, no matter how big or small. I would hate myself if I ever felt attracted to one of my classmates, because I knew lust was a sin, and if I felt that way, then I must be doing something wrong to allow those thoughts in my head. And beneath my Catholic and dedicated exterior was just a broken and unhealthy kid. So, back to the walk. I had known prior to the walk that I was doing poorly. That was not my realization. But what I came to realize is that I didn't deserve to be doing so poorly. I was doing everything I could to be as dedicated and faithful as I could possibly be. And all I got out of it was obsessiveness and unhappiness. I thought about it, and I just couldn't rationalize how a loving God could let faithful people fall apart in their attempt to praise Him. It just didn't seem right. It couldn't make sense to me. So I concluded one of two things must be the case. There is either a sadistic God who enjoys seeing people suffer or just doesn't care enough to intervene, or there is no God. And when I saw it in that way, it felt impossible to continue in my faith, because there is either a God I didn't want to praise, or nothing worth praising. And so during that moment, I began to become an atheist. Now, in a sense, I think I had begun long before. I have been doubting my belief in God for a very long time, but it wasn't until this particular walk that my doubts became strong enough and loud enough in my own head that I became conscious of them and finally gave power to them. I'm happy to admit that my personal experience for becoming an atheist is not the most logically sound. You know, maybe God was just testing me, and maybe I failed the test, or maybe I was just experiencing some sort of mental health issue, and I labeled it religion and threw the baby out with the bathwater. I acknowledge it. Yeah, that's true. So, I want to switch to a more rational discussion of God's existence, kind of remove myself from the topic a little bit, and give a better justification for why I believe what I believe. I'd like to start out by pointing out how confused the idea of the burden of proof can become in discussions about the existence of God. So, to explain this, I have a little example. So, imagine for a moment that I told you I had found a white M&M in my pack of M&Ms. Would you believe me? No, probably not immediately. You would be a little skeptical, maybe ask to see it or something, and that's perfectly reasonable. After all, the odds of finding a white M&M in a normal pack of M&Ms is extremely low. So, let's pause and think about this situation for a second. Who would bear the burden of proof? Would it be the person who is making the outlandish claim, or would it be the person who is skeptical of the claim? You know, I think any rational person would realize that it would be the person making the claim should bear the burden of proof. They should be the one having to show proof in order to defend their side. So, I gave this example to show that in discussions of whether God exists, it's unreasonable to expect the person who is skeptical about the existence of a supernatural being to try to have to leverage evidence when there is someone making the absurd claim in the first place. Now think about this. Put yourself in the shoes of the skeptic for a second, and imagine that I asked you to prove that I did not find a white M&M. How would you go about that? You know, if it were me, I think I would maybe research the manufacturing process and show just how improbable it is to end up with a white M&M in your package. You know, show how many checks they do, show how great their dyeing process is. But I really couldn't fully prove that you didn't find a white M&M in your package, just beyond the improbability of it. Now, that's exactly the issue for an atheist. An atheist can't prove that God doesn't exist. They can only show that it's extremely improbable. That's the best they can do. So, this example was primarily to show that to expect the skeptic to bear the burden of proof in this situation is a complete distortion of the normal idea of the burden of proof, and I think can lead to some unprofitable isn't quite as perfect as it seems to be. So, this is an approach to explaining why someone should believe in God based on maximizing their gains and minimizing their potential losses. So, allow me to explain it. The wager points out that if you don't believe in God and he ends up not existing, then you really gain nothing and lose nothing. For example, you wouldn't have given up any material pleasures to try to please a God, but you also wouldn't get yourself into an afterlife because, well, there wouldn't be an afterlife. Now let's say you don't believe in God, but he ends up existing. Well then, you're out quite a bit, because presumably whatever God you meet would be very unhappy that you did not praise him and believe in him, and you would likely land yourself in HE double hockey sticks, or whatever the equivalent of that is for whatever God exists. So, let's say you do believe in God, but he ends up not existing. Well then, you would land yourself out a little bit, You'd probably miss a few material pleasures and maybe some time on your Sundays, but you really wouldn't be out all that much. And now finally, let's say that you believe in God and he ends up existing. Well then, you have landed yourself the jackpot. Now, likely that God that exists would be happy that you believed and praised him and let you into whatever kind of happy afterlife might exist. So, Pascal said that any rational person looking at it this way would realize that if you do not believe in God, you can only lose or nothing, compared to if you believe in God, you have the potential to gain a lot or just lose a little bit, and any rational person would choose this branch because it has higher potential gain overall. Now I must say to Pascal that this is a very clever way to phrase the argument, but there's a couple main issues with it. The first issue is that it views believing and not believing and believing as choices, when in reality they aren't really choices. I could attend church every week and pray 12 times a day, but it doesn't mean that I can force myself into believing whatever God I'm praying to is actually there. I can't force myself to change my mind. You see, which branch you end up on is not so much a choice and more a result of how your brain works and how you were raised and maybe what stage of life you are in. But the point is, it's not a conscious choice. Even thinking about it, it's worth considering that even trying to force yourself to believe when maybe you don't might actually be worse off than not believing at all, because maybe God would appreciate honest skepticism over forced and fake belief. Okay, the other main issue with the wager is that it doesn't specify which God we're talking about. Now, presumably whatever person hears this will think of whatever God is prevalent in their culture, or maybe the one they were brought up to praise, but just because you were brought up to believe in a certain God doesn't make him any more likely to exist than a different God because someone else was brought up to believe in a different God. And to say that it's a different God for each person is absurd because, well then, we're not talking about objective truth, we're talking about opinion in that case. So, if we don't know which God we're talking about, you could actually land yourself in quite a sticky situation if you praise the wrong God and face a different God in the afterlife. They would likely be pretty unhappy. And funny enough, it seems that the wager can almost turn in on itself and support atheism, because you might be best off hedging your bets, not believing in any God, and if you end up facing a God, that way you can never have praised the wrong God, which is a likely possibility if you hedge your bets on one particular God. Just another interesting lens to think about it through. But yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Pascal's wager. If you are, hopefully you maybe thought a little bit more deeply into it with this discussion. And if you aren't, well, now you've heard about it and have some idea of how it works. But I wanted to bring it up because it comes up in theological discussions from time to time. And ironically, it seems that Pascal himself proposed this as more of a thought experiment, or more of a thought challenge than a proof itself, as it's often interpreted as. And so I personally don't take this very seriously, as it seems Pascal didn't himself. And I hope that you can come to your own thoughts about this too. Now I want to talk about a certain proof of God's existence that was able to convince my college theology professor. Now, this guy graduated from Princeton and Yale. I feel like that's worth mentioning. And the proof goes something like this. The fact that there is something rather than nothing must mean that a God has created the universe. And to be completely honest, I have no idea how this proof was able to convince my professor. I really don't think it proves God's existence at all, and pretty soon I'll explain why. But in order to do that, we're going to take a quick, and I admit odd, detour into the topic of evolution. So the effects of evolution are relatively small when you look at a small scale. For example, over a few hundred years, maybe a few thousand years, the effects of evolution are hardly noticeable. But when you give it a substantial amount of time, you start to see what exactly it's really doing. And I'm going to break it down here for you guys. So, we're starting out with a generation 0. We'll consider this the parent generation for whatever species we're talking about. So now imagine that each M&M here represents a different individual in the population. And you'll notice they're all blue in this case because we're imagining we're starting with a uniform population where they all are relatively similar. Now, something can happen called mutation, where by random chance, or sometimes by other environmental agents, genes in your DNA makeup will mutate, and instead of having their usual code, will code for something slightly different. So for example, in generation 1, this red individual represents an individual that has undergone mutation. Now, when you hear mutation, you might picture something out of a sci-fi movie. That's not what I'm talking about. Mutations, the vast majority of the time, are completely unnoticeable. They're changing something very, very slight, or perhaps even nothing at all. Well, the gene will change, but maybe the protein it makes doesn't. However, on some occasions, the mutation that the individual randomly underwent survival benefit. And if that's the case, then we say the fitness of that individual is higher, meaning they produce more offspring. And if you produce more offspring, and offspring resembles the parent, that mutation will begin to spread through the population. Now you can imagine this process repeating itself many generations over, and this mutation that's beneficial, helping its individuals to survive, causing itself to be passed on and passed on and passed on. If it helps its host, you could say, survive more effectively and reproduce more. Now if we look over a giant time scale, the final population might be entirely made up of individuals that have that mutation. And with maybe a subtle mutation, you wouldn't necessarily notice that change, or it wouldn't be large. But over a large period of time, you start to see the difference. And this can happen again, where maybe whatever began to mutate to help this generation might mutate in an even more drastic way. For example, maybe Generation 0 has no wings, and Generation X has very, very small wings. But you can imagine the process continuing, where Generation X goes from very, very small wings to something of a larger wing, and a larger wing, and a larger wing, until the entire population has large wings. Now, here's the thing with evolution in terms of the argument that I'm trying to make. If you only ever saw Generation X, you might assume that the vast complexity of life is proof of God's existence, or proof of intelligent design. But if you did that, you would be completely overlooking the vast amount of evolution that preceded it. You see, the complexity of life doesn't serve as good evidence for intelligent design when we know how evolution works now. Thanks to Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace, the two guys who pioneered the theory of evolution separately from one another, we learned to be wary of making attempts to assume that complexity requires intentional, intelligent design. So, you can transpose this argument now to the entire universe, or the cosmos, and see that just because we don't yet have a mechanism to explain the creation of the universe, or the coming into existence of the universe, doesn't mean that it necessarily had to be intelligently designed. Perhaps we just haven't yet figured out the theory of how it came into being. So for me personally, I think it's worth waiting for a similar explanatory process to explain the existence of the cosmos before we jump to any conclusions about supernatural beings, just because we've seen in the past that complexity does not equal creation. So I recently read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, and in it he presents a really interesting counter-argument to intelligent design, and it's focused entirely on improbability. Now, the argument and counter-argument originally used the image of a Boeing 747 and a junkyard, but I'll be adapting it just a little bit to fit the theme of this video. Welcome to the M&M Factory dumpster. So, you could argue for intelligent design by saying that yes, the origin of life is possible without intentional creation. odds of everything falling perfectly into place to allow it to happen is as improbable as a tornado hitting the M&M factory dumpster and assembling a perfect box of M&Ms. Now, before we get into the counter-argument for this notion of intelligent design, I want to talk about why this argument is weak in the first place. So, even though, yes, the origin of life is very statistically low for a given planet, you have to account for how many planets there are to try. So, even if the odds of the origin of life on a planet being 1 in a billion, well, considering that there are nearly a quintillion planets that we can identify or have become aware of, that's about a billion billions. We can expect life on a billion of them if the odds are 1 in a billion. But to return back to the counter-argument that I want to talk about to this idea of intelligent design, Dawkins pointed out that to say that the origin of life is as improbable as a tornado hitting an M&M factory and assembling a box of M&Ms completely defeats itself. Because to say that complexity is evidence of design would imply that a God who is complex enough to make life would have to have been created himself. The idea here is that if you say that the origin of life is like a box of M&Ms being created in a tornado out of the dumpster, then God, in his even greater complexity, is like creating an entire M&M factory out of the scraps at the M&M dumpster. My last order of business here is to tell you a little bit about what it's like since I have become an atheist. So, the first thing I'll say about it is it's been a little bit isolating. I think one of the best perks about being involved with religion is the community that it offers. And honestly, that's the main thing that I miss about it. Only a few of my friends and pretty much none of my family are openly atheist, and so it can be a little bit isolating when other people don't quite think the same way I do on a somewhat important topic. But in addition to being isolating, and the main reason that I've stuck with my decision is because I finally feel like there is some congruity between what I believe deep down and what I say I believe out loud. I lived most of my life so far believing the same thing deep down, but saying I believe something else out loud. And I think that's partially what led to the unhealthiness and the obsessive thoughts and things like that. I mean, no one tries to ardently convince themselves of something that they know they believe is true. So, I finally feel like what I say I believe is what I actually believe, and that has been the magic of the decision so far and why I've stuck with it. If you yourself practice a faith, then I'm so happy you watched this video. I just appreciate you having such an open mind to hear what I have to say. And if you are yourself an atheist or maybe a skeptic, agnostic, then I just want you to know that there are other people out there who think like you, even if maybe you don't know many in your immediate circle. You aren't crazy, trust me. I really hope that you have a good rest of your day,